Bemin's protest was cut off as Craig and Barber took him by the arms and walked him swiftly away. Lake turned to Anders. "Get a rope," he ordered. Anders paled a little. "A rope? What else does he deserve?" "Nothing," Anders said. Not after what he did." On the way out, they passed the place where Julia lay. Bemin had knocked her against the wall with such force that a sharp projection of rock had cut a deep gash in her forehead. A woman was wiping the blood from her face, and she lay limply, still unconscious. A frail shadow of the bold girl she had once been, with the new life she would try to give them an almost unnoticeable little bulge in her starved thinness. The lookout point was an outjutting spur of the ridge, 600 feet from the caves and in full view of them. A lone tree stood there, its dead limbs thrust like wide arms through the brown foliage of the limbs that still lived. Craig and Barber waited under the tree, Bemin between them. The lowering sun shone hot and bright on Bemin's face as he squinted back toward the caves at the approach of Lake and the other two. He twisted to look at Barber. "What is it? Why did you bring me here?" There was a tremor of fear in his voice. "What are you going to do to me?" Barber did not answer, and Bemin turned back toward Lake. He saw the rope in Anders' hand, and his face went white with comprehension. "No!" He threw himself back with a violence that almost tore him loose. "No! No!" Schroeder stepped forward to help hold him, and Lake took the rope from Anders. He fashioned a noose in it, while Bemin struggled and made panting animal sounds, his eyes fixed in horrified fascination on the rope. When the noose was finished, he threw the free end of the rope over the white limb above Bemin. He released the noose, and Barber caught it, to draw it snug around Bemin's neck. Bemin stopped struggling then, and sagged weakly. For a moment it appeared that he would faint. Then he worked his mouth soundlessly until words came. "You can't really hang me." Lake spoke to him. "We're going to hang you. What you stole would have saved the lives of 10 children. You've watched the children cry because they were so hungry, and you've watched them become too weak to cry or care anymore. You've watched them die each day, and each night you've secretly eaten the food that was supposed to be theirs. We're going to hang you, for the murder of children and the betrayal of our trust in you. If you have anything to say, say it now." "You can't. I had a right to live. To eat would have been wasted on dying people." Bemin twisted to appeal to the ones who held him, his words quick and ragged with hysteria. "You can't hang me! I don't want to die!" Craig answered him, with a smile that was like the thin snarl of a wolf. "Neither did 2 of my children." Lake nodded to Craig and Schroeder, not waiting any longer. They stepped back to seize the free end of the rope, and Bemin screamed at what was coming, tearing loose from the grip of Barber. Then his scream was abruptly cut off as he was jerked into the air. There was a cracking sound, and he kicked spasmodically, his head setting grotesquely to one side. Craig and Schroeder and Barber watched him with hard, expressionless faces, but Anders turned quickly away, to be suddenly and violently sick. "He was the first to betray us," Lake said. "Snub the rope and leave him to swing there. If there are any others like him, they'll know what to expect." The blue sun rose as they went back to the caves. Behind them, Bemin swung and twirled aimlessly on the end of the rope. 2 long pale shadows swung and twirled with him, a yellow one to the west and a blue one to the east. Bemin was buried the next day. Someone cursed his name, and someone spat on his grave, and then he was part of the dead past as they faced the suffering ahead of them. Julia recovered, although she would always wear a ragged scar on her forehead. Anders, who had worked closely with Chiara and was trying to take his place, quieted her fears by assuring her that the baby she carried was still too small for there to be much danger of the fall causing her to lose it. 3 times during the next month the wind came roaring down out of the northwest, bringing a gray dust that filled the sky and enveloped the land in a hot, smothering gloom, through which the suns could not be seen. Once black clouds gathered in the distance, to pour out a cloudburst. The 1.5 gravity gave the wall of water that swept down the canyon a far greater force and velocity than it would have had on Earth, and boulders the size of small houses were tossed into the air and shattered into fragments. But all the rain fell upon one small area, and not a drop fell at the caves. One single factor was in their favor, and but for it they could not have survived such intense, continual heat. There was no humidity. Water evaporated quickly in the hot, dry air, and sweat glands operated at the highest possible degree of efficiency. As a result, they drank enormous quantities of water. The average adult needed 5 gallons a day. All canvas had been converted into water bags, and the same principle of cooling by evaporation gave them water that was only warm instead of sickeningly hot as it would have otherwise have been. But despite the lack of humidity, the heat was still far more intense than any on Earth. It never ceased, day or night, never let them have a moment's relief. There was a limit to how long human flesh could bear up under it, no matter how valiant the will. Each day the toll of those who had reached that limit was greater, like a swiftly rising tide. There were 340 of them when the first rain came, the rain that meant the end of summer. The yellow sun moved southward, and the blue sun shrank steadily. Grass grew again, and the woods goats returned, with them the young that had been born in the north, already half the size of their mothers. For a while there was meat and green herbs. Then the prowlers came, to make hunting dangerous. Females with pups were seen, but always at a great distance, as though the prowlers, like humans, took no chances with the lives of their children. The unicorns came close behind the first prowlers, their young amazingly large and already weaned. Hunting became doubly dangerous then, but the bowmen, through necessity, were learning how to use their bows with increasing skill and deadliness. A salt lick for the woods goats was hopefully tried, although Lake felt dubious about it. They learned that salt was something the woods goats could either take or leave alone, and when hunters were in the vicinity they left it alone. The game was followed for many miles to the south. The hunters returned the day the first blizzard came, roaring and screaming down over the edge of the plateau, the blizzard that marked the beginning of the long, frigid winter. By then they were prepared as best they could be. Wood had been carried in great quantities, and the caves fitted with crude doors and a ventilation system. And they had meat, not as much as they would need, but enough to prevent starvation. Lake took inventory of the food supply when the last hunters returned, and held check-up inventories at irregular and unannounced intervals. He found no shortages. He had expected none. Bemin's grave had long since been obliterated by drifting snow, but the rope still hung from the dead limb, the noose swinging and turning in the wind. Anders had made a Ragnarok calendar that spring, from data given him by John Prentice, and he had marked the corresponding Earth dates on it. By a coincidence, Christmas came near the middle of the winter. There would be the same rationing of food on Christmas Day, but little brown trees had been cut for the children and decorated with such ornaments as could be made from the materials at hand. There was another blizzard roaring down off the plateau Christmas morning, a white death that thundered and howled outside the caves at a temperature of more than 80 degrees below zero. But inside the caves it was warm by the fires, and under the little brown trees were toys that had been patiently whittled from wood or sewn from scraps of cloth and animal skins, while the children slept. They were crude and humble toys, but the pale, thin faces of the children were bright with delight when they beheld them. There was the laughter of children at play,